Salutations and welcome to Bagehot. So we might still have a few more people coming in, but I think we can begin now. Thank you for your time and for your enthusiasm in registering for this public lecture. We had quite a number of registrations, so we should expect more to come in. Before we begin, there are some housekeeping messages. First off, do silence your phones. The restroom are located outside on both sides of the forum. And in the case of an emergency evacuation, there will be staff ready to provide you with instructions on what to do. On the order for today's event, after my introduction, we will have the Backstop. Then there will be a half an hour Q&A session. And for the learners who are here today, do fill in the evaluation forms given to you towards the end of the lecture. Okay, with that out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to be introducing to you Professor Mehrling. The truth is, I could spend a long time introducing him and telling you why you should get him out and learn in earnest. I spent 3 months this year completing his famous online course, and also scores of you here did the same. I also recently finished 2 of his books and read countless of his papers and essays. Speak to anyone in my team in Bagehot and you'll know that our conversations on things like money, liquidity, and on ideas by people like Mehrling and Fisher Black have taken on a considerably more intimate and richer perspective thanks to Professor Mehrling. But to hear me ramble on and on about him is not why we are here today, since he is here today. So instead, I'll be succinct and just highlight a few things about him. Firstly, at a more surface level, his biography. He's a professor of economics in Bretton College, Columbia University. He joined Bretton in 1987 after his PhD from Harvard University and MSc from London School of Economics. His most recent book is titled The New Lombard Street: How the Fed Became the Dealer of Last Resort. His book before that is Fisher Black and the Revolutionary Idea of Finance. Both are exceptional and highly recommended. Professor Mehrling is also famous for his online course on economics of money and banking hosted on Coursera. It is one of the most successful courses on the platform, and again, highly recommended. More than 100,000 students have actually taken that course from Professor Mehrling. The second thing I want to share with you is on where Professor Mehrling locates himself in the intellectual park of our discipline. His research focuses on the foundations of monetary economics and the history and applications of monetary economics and finance. In his own words, he sees himself in the American tradition of monetary thought that stretches from Alan Young, David Hanson, Albert Shaw, and Mehrling, all of whom engage in one way or another with the great tradition of British central banking. Central banking thought that stretches from Walter Legend, Ralph Autry, Richard Sayers, and Charles Fourier. Some of you might remember that last year, in this very same room, we had a public lecture by Professor Fourier. It is not really that much of a coincidence, really, that we invited the last 2 living members of these great traditions to the central bank. Which brings me to the third thing, why Professor Mehrling's approach resonates so much with central bankers and practitioners in general. It makes sense of the world from a concrete, practical perspective, which is firmly anchored on how the real world actually is. This seems obvious, but it is precisely this obvious direction that economics need to move towards for it to be useful, for it to provide solutions for the challenges for the 21st century. To end, I would like to cite part of the quote by Louis Bond from Professor Mehrling's second book. The quote is chosen, I believe, to describe Fisher Black, but to me it applies equally well to Professor Mehrling. It goes, "A cowardly fear of thinking curbs us all. To be original, you must listen to the voice of your heart rather than the clamor of the world, and have the courage to teach publicly what you have learned. The source of all genius is in sincerity." With this, please join me to welcome Professor Mehrling.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here, one of the last two living representatives. I'm 56 years old. I hope to be living a little bit longer. I am a different generation than Charles Bernard. And I hope he continues living for a long time as well. Very great friend of mine. This topic was more or less suggested to me, I think maybe by Alan or his team, modern financial systems and the role of central banks. And I think, and I took that topic. I didn't argue with it. I didn't change it at all, because I think it is, in some ways, the topic of the moment. That we've seen enormous changes in modern financial systems. Well, mostly negative, collapsing, and then trying to put them back together again. And in that process, we've seen enormous changes in the role of central banks, so the size of central banks, the size of their balance sheets, and their activity. They become much more center stage than they ever were before the financial crisis. And so there's a political economy dimension of this. The population, certainly in my country, is very anxious about this. Americans have always hated central banks, and they still do. And this is playing out in American politics right now. So it's important that those of us who pretend to know something about central banks have a message, and it can help the population understand where we are in history. What are the challenges? What are the legitimate concerns of the population? What are the legitimate expertise of the central bank? How is this changing? And what can we expect from the future? And I hope to just sketch a few ideas about that. The central challenge that I'll be focusing on is financial globalization. Financial globalization, which I see as a long-term trend, really since World War II. Not one step at a time, but two steps forward, one step back, with the establishment of Bretton Woods, the breakdown of Bretton Woods, the development of the European system, and so forth. And so this latest crisis, global financial crisis, is in some way the first crisis of this financially globalized world. And so we need to learn the lessons that this crisis has to teach us if we're not to slide more than two steps back and continue this forward progress toward unification of the world. You will see, and maybe we can talk in the Q&A, that I think financial globalization is ultimately I guess a good thing. Certainly it's a fact thing. It's something that we need to come to grips with and learn to live with and learn to manage. I often tell my students that if you want to understand the world today, you're a lot better reading books that are 100 years old than books that are 50 years old. Because the last era of financial globalization was with the pound sterling at the center of it before World War I, and we are back there again. With new sets of financial instruments, with fancy computers and telecommunications, and I can speak to my wife 13 hours away from here easily as if she were just in the next room. So that's new. But the issues of financial instability are old, and they're with us today. I want to start by just framing to you a little bit a way to think about financial globalization that may be new to you, and this is particularly for the younger students here. I think it's helpful to imagine a world as a sort of idealized world in which there's only one bank, one big bank, and everyone has an account at that bank. Some are positive accounts, some are negative accounts, overdrafts, and everyone uses their account at that bank to make payments to each other. those payment flows naturally expand and contract the size of the balance sheet of that bank. Just to give you an example, if a deficit agent at that bank, somebody with an overdraft, makes a payment to a surplus agent, somebody with a deposit account, that expands the balance sheet of that bank on both sides. The bank, in effect, is using the new deposit to make a loan to the deficit agent. And if there are different patterns of payments, credits might contract, it moves around. Those accounts, this is the second bullet point now, I want to build again on this image and think, if I'm a big deficit agent, so that I'm a big overdraft, the bank might encourage me to fund some of that, okay? Instead of having it be sort of due on demand, to issue a bond or something, and say that I'll pay in over a period of time. I'll make certain payments to get rid of this deficit. So I call those funding operations. And if I'm a big surplus agent, what do I want to hold deposit accounts of a large amount? I might want to invest them in something that pays a higher rate of interest or something like that. Those decisions don't necessarily match up, and so there's a role for a speculator, I call them, not to put too fine a point on it, who is exposed to both the creditor and the debtor, and perhaps taking that mismatch on as their own risk. So that creates the time and risk structure of credit. So we could imagine a world in which everyone was on one side or the other of this one big bank. And in some ways, that is the world we live in. The problem is that it's a decentralized world. It's not one big bank. It's a bunch of different banks, okay? And they actually quote their accounts in different prices, in different currencies. A lot of the apparatus you see in the financial system is an attempt to make this system work as if it were one big bank. Say the interbank money market is there within a country to make the banks within that country kind of operate as if they are one big bank. And then the foreign exchange markets are there sort of to make the banking systems of different countries operate as if they're one big bank. Not all countries are connected into this one big bank in the same way, and we're going to come to some of that. And it's not that easy to make it operate as one big bank. And sometimes different chunks of the system get out of whack, and they have capital controls or something, and they pull themselves out. Or they go back in, and there are other countries that are sort of very central to the system, others that are at the periphery. But I think it's helpful to wrap our minds around this idea of financial globalization, to see it as kind of an evolutionary, natural, organic tendency to create a world that's one big bank. That's what the system kind of wants to be. And we should think of our regulatory structures, we should think of our interventions, our monetary policy, with that in mind. Okay. Instead of what is natural for us to think, because we come from a world of sort of separate nation states. Okay? And we think of our own nation state, our own economy, and so forth. And that can be limiting. And it can also lead to conflict, where there's not necessarily conflict. I mean, it's one big world now. Not just in trade and global supply chains and so forth, but even more so in finance, because money is fungible, it moves around. So decentralization makes it so that we don't see this one big bank, and it makes it hard for the system to actually operate as if it were one big bank, but it's trying. Central banks play a role in this system. As a backstop to this decentralized system and the interactions between these central banks holding the system together. We're going to talk about swap lines today and what their role is. So those are bullet points. Let me just trouble you with a balance sheet or two, just to nail this point, particularly for the students in the room, to make sure that we understand what we're talking about, because I'm going to use some of this stuff later on. There's not going to be any algebra here. It's just balance sheets. Balance sheets are basically all you need for banking. So you can see the one big bank in the middle there. I have to stay close to the microphones here, otherwise I would run over there and point out where it is. But you can see the one big bank in the middle. There's me paying you. And I'm paying you by extending my overdraft position at the bank. And you're getting paid by accepting an extension of your deposit account. And I'm buying a house from you. Okay? this sort of thing happens in Malaysia all the time. That I'm buying a house from you, so you transfer the house to me, and I pay you, but I pay you essentially by borrowing from the one big bank. And where does the savings come from that I'm borrowing? It comes from you, okay, that you're accumulating a deposit. So this one big bank is expanding its balance sheet on both sides. The next line down there, you can see this funding operation that I'm talking about, that I'm exchanging my overdraft for a mortgage, a long-term loan with the bank. And this investment operation for you, I'm showing as exchanging your deposit account for a term deposit. Okay. Those are not the same thing. So there's a risk structure in being short a term deposit and long a mortgage. That's the speculator. So this is just an example to get firm on what that first and second bullet point were like in the previous slide. And to summarize the points of this slide, which is that payments, the international system, the economic system, is a payment system, and it operates by elasticity of credit, by creation of credit and destruction of credit. The funding involves tailoring of liabilities and assets to the preferences of the deficit and surplus agents. And speculation is involved in bearing mismatch between these preferences for a price, not for free, but with a profit benefit. This is what's happening in the world as a whole. The challenge is the decentralization of it. Often you can't see that because the person who is the deficit agent may be in one country, okay, and the person who's the surplus agent is in another country. Or in one jurisdiction, legal jurisdiction, and another legal jurisdiction. And so this problem of knitting the system together into one is not a trivial one. Okay? That's what the financial system is all about. And sometimes it breaks. So this is the balance sheet of the Fed. Basically, the central bank of the world. We'll come to that in a bit. Whether it wants to be or not. And this is the balance sheet of the Fed during the financial crisis. I'm showing its assets on the top and its liabilities on the bottom as negative numbers, so you can see the expansion of the balance sheet. Those two dashed lines. The first one is Bear Stearns. The second one is the AIG Lehman in September of 2008. And you can see the transformation. If you ever wanted to prove to somebody that there's been a transformation in central banks, just show them this picture. Okay? That before, to the left of the diagram, this is a very simple operation. Okay? The central bank has about $800 billion worth of currency as its liability, and $800 billion worth of treasury bills as its asset, and that's basically it. There's a little bit of bank reserves, about $50 billion. Okay. There's a little bit of other stuff and a little bit of gold and this and that. But basically, it's currency on one side and treasury bills on the other side. Not anymore. Not anymore. This chart takes you only up through 2010, but actually the balance sheet has expanded even more since then because of QE 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So we've been through the looking glass of Alice here, and we're in a different world, and we haven't been there anymore. Or rather, I would say, the closest we've been to this looking glass is war finance. When you're fighting a world war, this is what happens in the balance sheet of your central bank. Because the central bank is funding the government. You know, it's buying all the government debt that the normal population won't buy. It's expanding its own balance sheet. And I think I'll come back to that analogy because we know that it takes a while, and it's not that easy to move from war finance back to peace finance. This is the challenge we have ahead of ourselves. It's not just about moving the Fed funds rate 25 basis points, as happened recently. So I think we are at a Bagehot moment. Ellen was very nice to plug my latest book, New Lombard Street, which you will all have, this audience will know, is an explicit homage to Bagehot, the old Lombard Street, I like to call it. And Bagehot was writing in 1873 at a time when the Central Bank of England was trying to work out what its role was in society. And Bagehot said, here's what you do, okay? Your role is to put a floor on prices. And he created the Bagehot rule. In times of financial crisis, lend freely at a high rate against security that would be good in normal times. Okay? That's the Bagehot rule. And central banks, this was a very controversial book when it was published, but then that became orthodoxy. Okay? And so this is what all central banks think of as their job today. He argued in that book, if you read it, and you must read it, you really must read that. Go on the left there, I mean. He's saying to the bankers, look, I'm a student of history, and I've been watching what you do every time there's a financial crisis. And that's basically what you do. You lend freely at a high rate against secured industry. You find some reason to do that, but usually you don't admit it. You know, in congressional testimony or parliamentary testimony in that case, you don't admit it. Okay, but this is what you do, and you know what? It's the right thing to do. So why don't we actually bring it up into the open and look at it and say that's what we're going to do every time? This is the beginning of monetary science, from my point of view, and monetary policy. Because once the central bank takes on responsibility for putting a floor under a crisis, it's very natural that it says, you know, we would really like to avoid a crisis. So then they take on more responsibilities, you know, microprudential responsibilities, or even monetary policy. How can we prevent the bubble? How can we stabilize business cycles? There's nothing in Bagehot. If you read this book, there's nothing there about stabilizing the economy. Okay, it's just about how to put a floor on a crisis. This is the beginning. This is the beginning, and all of the tradition of British monetary thought follows from there. As a historian, you could trace it further back too, you know, to Tooth and Fullerton and Thornton and all of that. But it's Bagehot really that puts it on the map as this is where we're going to start from now on. I think we're at a Bagehot moment today. This behavior of the Fed, and it's similar if you look at the balance sheet of the ECB, look at the balance sheet of the Swiss National Bank, look at the balance sheet of the Bank of Japan. There's similar kind of story there. So we are in a Bagehot moment where we are rethinking what is it that the role of central banks are going to be in this brave new world that we are living in and are having to learn how to cope with as time goes on. I think it's not just a Bagehot moment. I think it's a Bretton Woods moment. This is about the international monetary system. If you look at this chart, it's showing the spread between the overnight index swap, which is a kind of term Fed funds rate you can think of, and LIBOR, the euro-dollar interest rate, at 1 month and at 3 months. Same term as what I was showing the Fed's balance sheet there. And you can see a spread of 100 basis points and a spread of 300 basis points for borrowing and lending in dollars for the same term. This shows you something very seriously is wrong, okay, with the system, that essentially par between the international private dollar and the domestic public dollar currency, the liabilities of the Fed, was under threat here. If you need to pay a higher rate of interest in one of these currencies, that is the international private dollar, than in the domestic one, that par is coming under stress. That par did not break. The international currency, the international world reserve currency, is still the dollar. We survived it, and we survived it basically because the Fed created swap lines with other central banks, $600 billion worth, after Lehman and AIG. That was to take care of that 300 basis points. So these swap lines were very key in putting the international monetary system, putting a floor on the globalization of this crisis. You remember, it was originally supposed to be just a subprime mortgage crisis. And very famous economists, teachers of mine, said, oh, there'll be nothing here. There's not that much subprime mortgage. It could all go away tomorrow, and there'll be nothing. What did those people get wrong? What they got wrong was they didn't pay attention to the way these mortgages were being financed. Okay? And they were being financed in the world money markets. And so when they ran into trouble, the world money markets ran into trouble. And the world money market is the dollar money market. When the dollar money market runs into trouble, the world runs into trouble. And that's how it became a global financial crisis. The economics profession has been very challenged by this crisis. And the way economists talk, okay, they say, well, there's these puzzles. There's these things we have to figure out. Why was risk mispriced? Why did small losses in subprime threaten the system? Why did the crisis become global? And these are the kinds of answers that my colleagues tend to give. Irrationality, unpriced solvency put, interconnectedness, contagion. I'm not going to talk about any of that stuff. Okay. I think that from the system-wide level, the answer to all three of these things is that it has something to do with liquidity. Okay, that there was liquidity that was causing the price risk to be mispriced. Liquidity troubles, liquidity crises were what was at the core of all of this. And I understand, and I hope I can convince you today, the global financial crisis was a stress test of financial globalization. That's what it was. We passed that test. So far, we're still here. And we did not fall into a Great Depression as we did in the 1930s, largely because the pass-off from the sterling to the dollar wasn't done yet in the 1930s. And it had definitely been done by 2007. And the Fed did what it had to do to backstop the world system. And it was strong enough to do that. You know, if the Bank of England had been strong enough to backstop the world system after World War I, we wouldn't have had a Great Depression, I think. But it was not. It was not. The baton was being passed, and it fell in the middle of that pass. This is the story that I want to identify with Charlie Himmelberger's story about the World Depression, who I would add a third, but he's not living. He's here in spirit. I identify with that tradition, and you'll see some echoes. And I'll come back. The very last slide, you'll see. This is my next book, by the way. I'm writing a biography of Charlie Himmelberger as a story of the rise of the dollar system. So I'm trying some of these ideas out on you right now from my current research. All right, that's by way of framing. Let me say a few words. Shadow banking. I want to talk about shadow banking, not because it's so important to Malaysia, where banking is much simpler, but because it is, I think, the quintessential form of banking for a financially globalized world. And so we need to understand it, because this is where the prices are coming from, the prices of funding and the prices of risk. Whether you are part of the system or not part of the system, this is where the prices are coming from in the one big bank world. Right? What is shadow banking? My definition of shadow banking is different from most people. Most people define it as stuff that's not regulated and should be, or something like that. I have an analytical definition, which is money market funding of capital market lending. So the funding is coming from a market, okay, wholesale money market. Okay? And the lending is being priced in a market, a capital market. So this is different from Jimmy Stewart banking. It's not deposits funding individual mortgage loans. It's short-term money market funding of mortgage-backed securities. This is global funding, dollar funding, of local, sometimes foreign exchange lending. As perhaps we'll have time in Q&A, I think of the Asian financial crisis as kind of the first crisis of this system, where it was a currency crisis because of that. We were having local lending, but global funding in dollars. Market price, but from that now I want to emphasize that as opposed to the banking of your textbooks, there's market pricing on both sides of the balance sheet, money and capital. And that means there's a key role for the market-making institutions that are creating those prices, dealers, as I'll say, and a key role for the central bank as backstop of those dealers, not of the banks, but of the market makers, of the people who are making the prices. This is a sort of new function of central banks that they're not that aware of, and it's a consequence of this new kind of banking. Here in balance sheets, I'm just showing you a little bit of what I mean. So there's a shadow bank, money market funding of capital market lending. So there's dollar repo there on the liability side, and there's a foreign exchange risky asset, foreign exchange denominated risky asset there that is being funded by that. I'm showing the derivative markets as sort of taking out all the risk, the default risk, the duration risk, the foreign exchange risk, and selling that on to the asset manager there. This is a conceptual story. This is a lot of what the shadow banking system was trying to do with tranching and all kinds of complicated stuff. I'm imagining a much cleaner system in which it's all done with derivatives, and you can very precisely tailor the risk exposure and move it around. That moving around of credit risk was a disaster, and it's part of what broke. But not surprisingly, it's what was sort of new about the system. So it hadn't been tested as well. Here's the dealers. I said the dealers are central, and I put them now in between the shadow bank and the asset manager. Now I'm calling the shadow bank the capital funding bank, just to get away from the negative connotations of shadow. But you see, it's the same money market funding of capital market lending there. And the point is that this funding is passing through a global money dealer, and that's where the price of funding is created in the global money markets. And the risk is passing through derivative dealers. These are investment banks, and now many of these positions are being on central counterparty balance sheets. But they were on individual investment bank dealer balance sheets during the crisis. This is where the price of risk is formed in these derivative markets today. This image of the world, at sort of the most financially developed part of the world, okay, is where the prices are happening, and then those prices move out into the periphery, into other currencies, into other markets where they don't have such fancy financial instruments as this. I'm from New York. You can tell because I speak fast. But that's the joke part. The serious part is that this is what's happening in New York. Okay, I'm describing the world that my students and that is happening, just downtown from where I've been working for 28 years, and that makes me a little parochial in some way. Okay, except fortunately, this is actually the center of the world system. So knowing how this works means that you know a lot about how the world works, even if it's only really Manhattan. It is the financial center of the world system. The dealers are important for making the prices, and what we learned in the financial crisis is that the central banks are important for backstopping the dealers. And I'm showing you here exactly how that happened. That the global money dealers had a liquidity put, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, to the traditional banking system. So did the derivative dealers have a liquidity put, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, to the traditional banking system. And of course, the traditional banking system had a liquidity put to the central bank. Okay. The activation of these puts is what made the balance sheet of the Fed blow up, okay, in the way that it did. That it was backstopping that system. I can go into more detail about that, but I think it's important to move on to think about the future. As I say, we're in a Bagehot moment and a Bretton Woods moment. Here's a sort of summary slide of where I think we are going. We aren't there yet, but it seems to me that we're putting in place the components of a new way of running central banks. Stability policy for a market-based credit system, so this is the Bagehot part, okay, seems to me about the central bank creating bounds on asset prices, an outside spread, not an inside spread. Okay, meaning, at the moment, as we know, central banks are actually making prices. They are the dealers. They are creating market prices. But Janet Yellen and basically all central bankers would like not to do that forever. Okay? They would like the private dealer system to come back into place and have actual market prices at some point. Sooner rather than later. Personally, I think it would be later rather than sooner, just because this is a hard transition. But let's just have a notion of where we're trying to go. This isn't about moving the Fed funds rate 25 basis points, right? This is about the Fed becoming a supporter of markets rather than the market itself. Okay? That's what we're about. The new thing about this, I think that's basically the Fed always did this in funding markets. That's not so new. We call it the discount window. That's sort of an outside spread concept. The new thing is doing this in risk markets as well, creating outside spreads there, perhaps indirect in various ways. I think by backstopping these CCPs, that's basically where that's going to be happening, which is the magical part of the system. Possibly in time, this outside spread can be time varying. I remember, in history, the way the Bagehot rules started to get implemented is the Bank of England set a price, 6%. It said, we will discount at 6%. And basically nobody came to the bank until market rates moved and hit 6%. Over time, the central bank learned if we move that 6% that discount rate around, we can have influence on people's behavior today, and that's the origin of monetary policy. I think we're going to be doing something similar with this outside spread, that this is going to become a policy variable, maybe in my lifetime. I'm young. I'm just so it's going to take some time, is the way of saying I'm young. The international piece of this is being sorted out too. Liquidity. This is a global funding system. So the liquidity issue is inherently global. But we don't have any global central banks. The central banks are all nationally based. So the liquidity put that the system is going to have to central banks is a joint responsibility of the major central banks. And that's what these swap lines are about. These permanent, unlimited swap lines between the C6, the big central banks, the Fed, ECB, Swiss National Bank, Bank of Japan, Bank of Canada, and which one did I forget? Bank of England, of course. They're the former central bank of the world. We can't forget them. You're going to see the very next slide about Bank of England. So liquidity put is a joint responsibility of the central banks. How that's going to play out politically remains to be seen, because the central banks can have agreements with each other, okay, but they have to sell this to their political masters at some point, and there could be, okay, we're going to see how this works. It's pretty clear that the Fed is never going to be allowed by Congress to lend $600 billion to the ECB and so forth ever again. Okay, so the expansion of dollar balances on central banks is not going to be on the balance sheet of the Fed. Okay, it's going to be elsewhere in the system. That's the liquidity piece. Okay, the hard thing is separating this now from the solvency piece. It looks to me like the solvency piece, solvency backstops, are not going to be global. They're going to be local. They're going to be treasury functions, not central bank functions. And you notice that the different central banks have chosen different kinds of securities to buy. In the U.S., it's been mortgages because the Americans love their houses, and we've always had very special rules about home ownership in the United States. And so this is a privileged kind of asset, and so the Fed can acquire this asset, but and the same with Europe. European project sort of requires supporting European peripheral debt, and so it'll be different in different jurisdictions, but these will be local responsibilities. Remember how this crisis worked. The shadow banking system was largely in Europe. Okay? It was on the balance sheet of people like the Union Bank of Switzerland and so forth that were borrowing in the dollar repo market and buying residential mortgage-backed security tranches in dollars on both sides. So there was no foreign exchange risk, but there was a lot of liquidity risk. And when they couldn't roll their funding, they were going to have to liquidate those portfolios. They were going to have to sell those mortgage-backed securities. They did not sell them because the Fed refinanced them and gradually repatriated them. Okay, this is the solvency part. It was the responsibility of the U.S. to take those assets back, basically at par, which they did. The AAA tranche parts at par. A lot of the first expansion of the Fed's balance sheet, this $1 trillion of mortgage-backed securities, was the way that they did take this back through refinancing and stuff like that. It's a longer story. But so this is an image of the world as it's coming to be. Here's one. So this is the Bank of England under Mark Carney, widening lending access to the shadow banking sector. You may remember this. Mark Carney saying, "We're open for business." Remember that. You cannot imagine Janet Yellen saying, "Oh, shadow banking sector, we're open for business." Okay, that she would never do that. Okay, so this is happening in the Bank of England. And they're as a backstop, as a liquidity backstop for the world shadow banking system. And the date on this article in the FT is June 2014. Okay, so this is one moment in creating a new kind of a backstop through a very important central bank. Okay, that has a permanent and unlimited swap line with the Fed as of October 2013. So that's what this one is about. Central banks agreed to retain swap lines. So that it's a credible thing when Mark Carney says we're going to provide liquidity to the world shadow banking system. There's not a problem that the pound is not actually the world reserve currency. He has access to the world reserve currency if he ever needs it. This is the world as it's being created. So I now want to, the last bit here, I want to say some things about the international monetary system. So in a way, this is returning to my first slide, where I was urging you to think of the world as one big bank, and to think of the international monetary system as the different mechanisms through which decentralized banking systems are knit together and into a system that operates as if it were one big bank, or as closely as possible. The one thing you notice that is maybe the major obstacle to the one big bang concept is the nation state. These borders, okay, and political systems that are located in geographic units and have different currencies and so forth. So they're engaging with the rest of the world through that border. So I want to give you an image of what's going on in the relation between these nation states. These nation states are themselves collections of deficit agents and surplus agents. And they are, however, they are agents of themselves that are either deficit or surplus agents with the rest of the world. Okay, so there's cash flows out, cash flows in. We should think of the nations of a country as a bank in this sense. Okay? That it is also, if it's a deficit agent, it faces the problem of funding that deficit. If it's a surplus agent, of investing that surplus. The elasticity of credit for payments is key for engaging with the world trading system. Everything I said that you accepted, I could see you not, okay, readily when it seemed to be about you and me. Okay, I now am saying it's not you and me, it's your country and my country. Okay, it all goes through. Okay, not at the same level. The survival constraint is the thing that keeps the system in order, meaning that you have to make payments. You have to make good on your payments in the coin of the realm, which happens to be the dollar. Okay, the world reserve currency, and that's a discipline that is asymmetric. That affects deficit agents have to pay the surplus agents in the best money in the world. That's the discipline that keeps the system orderly, that makes it operate as if one big bank. Sometimes that discipline is too much, okay, and it breaks. And so there's a sudden stop, or there's capital controls, or something like that. Better, the system we're trying to develop is one where there are deep and liquid short-term capital markets, such that higher layers can provide elasticity. When there are temporary cash outflows, you can just borrow that cash back. Okay, so it's not a binding constraint on you. The creditors are willing to do this. The private creditors, not the IMF, okay, not the U.S. Treasury, okay, but the private creditor. That's what you're working toward, okay, because that's where all the money is. And you don't have to negotiate with the IMF if some banker is willing to lend you that money. But that's a challenge, getting there, being part of that natural hierarchy of credit and money. So the international monetary system is a payment system. Those of you who've taken my course, which I guess Alan said is all of you, know that there's only two ideas in the course. Okay, one is that banking is a payment system, and the other is banking is a market-making system. This is true of the international system as well. Okay, the international system is a payment system. I just talked about that. Now the international monetary system is a market-making system. Part of or I would say the key intellectual challenge and also political challenge, economic challenge of dealing with this idea is the hybrid character of money. That domestic money, we already know, is part public and part private. In the United States, there's $1 trillion actually of currency or so, okay, which is public money. And there's many more trillions than that, which is the liability of private banks. These two monies trade at par. Okay? This is not an easy thing to fix a price in a market system, so that requires market making. Somebody who's willing to go both ways. When there's an attempt of people to move into the government currency, attempt of people to move into the private currency, to maintain par between those things is not easy. Maintain a two-way dealing. But international money is also part public, part private, with exchange rates maintained by two-way dealing as well. And that's also not so easy. I mean, exchange rates, par is hard. That's a price that doesn't move. Okay? Exchange rates can move. Okay, and they do move, and sometimes they move a lot. So it doesn't all have to be absorbed on the dealer balance sheet if some of the stress is absorbed in price. By profit-seeking dealers, I think of as the suppliers of market liquidity of first resort. And they're, I'm going to skip over this difficult economics about the expectations hypothesis, the term structure, and uncovered interest parity. That's what those things are about. And emphasize that the central bank ideally is serving as dealer of last resort. Okay? That it's the backstop for this private system. This is where you want to try to be getting. In countries with not very developed financial systems, inevitably the central bank is the dealer in foreign exchange. Okay, that's the way it is. And if there's not even much of a domestic banking system, it also is basically providing the domestic money supply. So it depends on where you are in your financial development, how you're going to hook into this international system. But having a sense of where you're going is always helpful. The emergent international monetary system, I think, looks like this. That it is a dollar system. It's still a dollar system, notwithstanding all the people don't like that, or they think it's unfair, or something. We can talk about why people think it's unfair. But it is. It's a dollar system. Is the world reserve, both private and international dollars. The Fed is really only backstopping, however, the U.S. It's not going to ever act as a central bank of the world. It's this collection of central banks, the C6 swap lines, okay, which is operating as the central bank of the world. That's at the top of the level, and then there are bilateral swap lines that connect down farther in the hierarchy. I'm putting here particularly an earlier version of this talk I gave in Shanghai, so people think that China is there for that. But and there are regional arrangements that connect farther out. Shanghai, which Malaysia is involved here. The IMF is a public alternative. So here's a picture. Forget about this. Here's a picture. The dollars on top, okay, the big six are next in this hierarchy, bilateral swaps, and then every country has its own national money, its own national credit. So there's a hierarchy of international money, just as there's a hierarchy of domestic money. And this is the system that we are putting in place. Every country hooks into that hierarchy in different ways. There's a spectrum of hybridity. Reserve currency, like the dollar, there's deep and liquid dealer markets, and the central bank is only serving as backstop for those markets. But farther way down the hierarchy, for peripheral countries that don't have very deep markets, the central bank is the market maker, not the backstop. They are the market for lack of anything else. And then there are intermediate cases in the middle. And the exchange rate regimes sort of follow that pattern as well. So there's a variety. Why do I emphasize this? If you're, we're all economists here. If you take a course in foreign exchange, okay, very often the way that the theory of foreign exchange is talked about is in this abstract way. There's country A and there's country B, and we're talking about the price at which one currency trades for another. What I'm emphasizing here is that we need to know where those countries are in the hierarchy. That the story of exchange rates between countries at the top of the hierarchy, okay, between the ECB and the U.S., is just not the same as the story of exchange rates between the top and the periphery, or between different peripheral states. We need to understand this as a system, as a hierarchical system. And you see this all the time, the stresses that are happening right now. Some countries, their currencies are, we just heard, Argentina, special case, just depreciated by 30%. Okay, that's a big move. That's a big move even in Malaysia. Okay? But the PBOC, not 30%. A couple of percentage points is still a very dramatic thing. The ECB, a couple of percentage points, is a very dramatic thing at the core of the system. It's a hierarchical system, and it's an unstable system. I think we just need to confront this fact, that it's inherently unstable. One of the great, this is why Ralph Hawtrey went to heaven, okay? Because he invented the word inherent instability of credit, and he just would not let this go. He said, that's just the way credit is. Okay? That It is inherently unstable because it's dealing with the future, which is unknown, and there's other reasons as well. He was talking about a system much simpler than ours. He was talking about also a system that had sterling at the center of it, and trying to think about how the Bank of England could manage that instability. Just as Bagehot had said in 1873, the Lombard Street has a great deal of money to manage. Even more so by the time Ralph Hawtrey is writing before World War I. He's talking about a bank loan-based credit system, basically, but the same is true of our modern capital market-based credit system, in our modern global money funding system. It's inherently unstable. It needs to be managed. It needs to be managed by this collection of central banks. This is a challenging thing to do for political economy reasons, not just technical reasons. The liquidity backstop is inherently global and inherently public because it's a central bank operation, whereas solvency backstop is inherently local and inherently private. We don't want to fail. We want people who lose money to lose money, okay, and to go out of business as part of the discipline of the system. But liquidity, in practice, liquidity and solvency are intertwined. And people who are going bankrupt always want to say, no, it's a liquidity problem, and therefore a problem for the public sector to give me money, okay, as opposed to my problem, and I need to just go out of business. So this is and they can appeal to the agents of their own state. It's going to be not so easy, and there's going to be mistakes on both sides. Errors of type 1 and type 2. But the important thing is to remember that we're trying to figure out how to live in a world, in a financially globalized world. What we're managing is the balance between discipline and elasticity at the level of the world. Is the private sector supply of market liquidity too much or too little? Which way should central banks be living? And how are they going to cooperate with each other? What should the Bank of England be doing? What should the Bank of Japan be doing? How are they going to cooperate with each other? Money will not manage itself, and Lombard Street has a great deal of money to manage. Lombard Street is London. We need to update this Bagehot quote. New Lombard Street has a great deal of money to manage. Here's my last slide. I'll close on this. Our challenge, and the challenge of central banks everywhere, is learning to live with financial globalization. One of the people who saw this challenge clearly a long time ago was Charlie Kimberley and his co-authors, Neil Dupre and Walter Salon, in a very famous article they published in The Economist in 1966, when there was all this anxiety in the United States and in the world about the U.S. trade deficit, and that somehow the U.S. was not being responsible in its role as the base currency for the Bretton Woods system. And he was putting this on the table for people to think about. He was saying, I'll just read this quote. He said, an effective, smoothly functioning international capital market is itself an instrument of world economic growth. Private markets, he's talking about, are good for growth. Not a nuisance which can be disposed of and the functioning of which can be transferred to new or extended intergovernmental institutions. He's talking there about the IMF and the attempt to create SDRs and things like that as the solution to this problem. He goes on, the main requirement of international monetary reform is to preserve and improve the efficiency of the private capital market while building protection against its performing in a destabilizing fashion. Okay. This is the inherent instability of credit he's talking about. Okay. That it is going to behave in a destabilizing fashion, and we just need to accept that and build protection around that, build bounds around that, so that when that instability emerges, it may take us one step back, but it doesn't take us back to the start. And we can rebuild and keep moving forward. Words to live by. We need to learn to live with financial globalization. Charlie was right back in 1966, a little premature, okay? But I think I would endorse all of that. And words to live by going forward in 2015 as well. Thank you. We're finished by 11, and it's 10:59.
Right, now we can open it for questions. Perhaps what this works can do, if there are a lot of questions, you can collect 3 questions in one go.
Thank you, Professor. Professor, how do you make sense of the geopolitics of our times affecting the shape of financial globalization? Not just commodities, but themes like the weaponization of finance, and so on. Thank you.
Do you want to take a few more?
There was a lot of emphasis on the credit system is inherently unstable. And my question is, how do we recognize when it is becoming unstable? Do you have any measures of trying to determine that now is the time to do something, as opposed to this is more or less normal cyclical variations of credit or money?
Anyone else?
Okay. So these are rather different questions. Geopolitics. The weaponization of finance is kind of a bad idea. I may say, I'm a professor, so I'm not beholden to any central bank or government or anything. So, no, this one big bank idea, right, is saying is a world run on commercial principles. That's the idea. Okay, it's run on commercial principles, not geopolitical principles, in which every citizen is enlisted in the battle to achieve a trade surplus, or I don't know what. And I think that you cannot make financial globalization work if it becomes politicized like that. That is a destructive force. I do believe that there's a win-win here. Okay, that the one big bank idea is the ability of everyone to trade with everyone, and that's a kind of win-win in the large. But it's hard to see often in the small, and it's maybe even hard to see in the short run. So it's easy for it to break down. I think markets, as I say, this is organic, and the market's trying to come to life, but there's a lot of obstacles, and geopolitics are some of it, as a matter of fact. Now, when you talk about commodities, I assume you mean sort of strategic fighting over scarce resources, oil resources, or scarce copper, or something like that too. Well, nations are going to do that, I suppose. But again, I do think that history tells us that commercial principles are better if they're more peaceful. John Kenneth Galbraith used to say, it's a good thing they're all just fighting about their bonuses, because otherwise they would be shooting at each other. So this is the world we want. We want people fighting over their bonuses, not over territory. Whether we can get it or not, that's, I don't know. Human beings are not that far from lower order animals. But it's the challenge that is ahead of us. The issue, the second question, you put your finger exactly on it. Well, this is exactly what we have to do, is to try to find measures that indicate that trouble is brewing, and not only that, but measures that think about what kind of instruments do we have to head that off. Because it's not clear to me that the old instruments are going to be working. The way central banks, or the way you see the language about the Fed, as if somehow the Fed funds rate is some enormously powerful thing. Look, the Fed is a big bank. It's important, but it's just one. Okay, and there's a whole world out there, and there's a market there is a market interest rate that is struggling to get out from under the central banks. That's where we need to be thinking about, and we're not going to get accurate measures of imbalances as long as we're trying to run the system in a way. So I'm not a practicing central banker, so I don't have precise advice about that. But I think that the one big bank idea is going to lead you to look at the right kinds of measures. you need to think of every subgroup, every nation, is a collection of banking units, cash inflow, cash outflow units. And when you're experiencing net cash outflow, so you're moving close to what I call the survival constraint, where you're going to be forced to do something. You're going to be kicked out of the international system, okay, if you don't do something pretty soon. There needs to be some process of evaluating, well, why is that? Why is that? Is that really because what you're doing at the moment is what the world doesn't want you to do? That you need to readjust your economy in such a way that you get a better flow? Or that might not be what's happening. It might just be that you're in a period where you're investing for the future, that you have plenty of cash flows, they're just not now, they're in the future. And you need to find a way of bridging between now and the future and getting the world to help you bridge that. You're trying to issue a bond, that your overdraft has hit its limit. And one thing to do is to then stop spending until your overdraft gets back to zero. Another thing to do is to fund that overdraft, okay? And so that your overdraft goes back to zero again, and you have long-term debt that you can pay back in the future, and then the settlement constraint is less money. That's, I think, what a lot of the international institutions that are giving advice to countries like Malaysia are kind of trying to do, whether they have that in their mind exactly. And they tend to be thinking of countries as isolated rather than part of a system as a whole. For every deficit agent, there's a surplus agent. So it's every exorbitant deficit is the counterpart of some exorbitant surplus. That means that there's a win-win. The surplus can always fund the deficit. That's the nature of it. Okay? The question is whether it will and under what conditions. So that's just all vague rambling. But that's an indication of where we are. We're at a rather primitive moment, I think, where we should realize that a lot of the measures that we have been looking at aren't helping us that much. And I'm trying to put forward here a framework for thinking that might help us come up with new measures. I don't have anything precise to propose at the moment, but you're absolutely right. That's the right question. To ask the question. Maybe you have something in mind. We can talk about it.
There are various institutions and people in institutions. I'm thinking particularly about the BIS on the one hand, and researchers such as Alan Taylor and Larry and those guys talk a lot about credit, private credit, or expanding in relation to some measure of what is the normal level of credit.
Well, that's right.
Thinking about credit cycles and things of that nature.
So let me just endorse both of those references, okay, here in public and for the students. That if you haven't read the latest quarterly report of the BIS, you should. And see how they're trying to think about this. There is, I think, no organization in the world that has more data about banks than the BIS. And they are trying to think about where these pressures are emerging. And they're very worried about emerging market private debt at the moment, which is largely dollar-denominated debt. And so when the currency of those countries goes down 30%, their debt goes up 30%. And that is a difficult situation to be in. So the BIS is imagining that's where the crisis is going to come from, for example. Schiller and Taylor, their work, which INET has funded largely, has tried to shift the attention of regulators away from government debt, public debt. Reinhardt and Rogoff write this notion that 90% is the magic number, that beyond 90% is hell, you drop off the edge of the earth or something. And that this is about government debt. And what Schiller and Taylor point out is that private debt, okay, is just as much a cause of financial crisis as public debt. In fact, mostly, as a matter of fact. And often the large public debts come from an attempt to bail out the private sector. Okay, they're not because of profligacy or bad tax systems or overspending or something like that. So this points to again this hybridity character. Okay, that when we think that the government is the only thing that can ever cause trouble, we're assuming that somehow there's not an inherent instability in the private sector. Okay, that and we don't have to watch it. that there's some sort of self-regulation going on there. I want to say no. In the history of central banking, the reason we have central banks is precisely because money doesn't manage itself. Okay, that it's not self-regulating. It requires somebody trying to take a higher point of view. Okay, and think about the system as a whole, and not just think about their own private profitability, but think about stability. And so, in my world, the central banks are the good guys, okay, or they should be, they could be, and that gets me in trouble with my friends on the left. They think I've gone to the dark side, but but I think that's what history shows. That certainly putting a floor under this financial crisis was a very good thing for ordinary people. Okay? It would not have been good for the world if we had let this thing run its course. How to get things going again is another problem. But it was a good thing to not let it run its course. And we know how to do that, and we can do that again. But there's a big challenge ahead of us. And those are two sources. Write them down and Google them. You'll find they're very, very useful.
All right, any more questions? Yes.
Professor, in one of your diagrams, right, you showed the hierarchy of the central bank, or what role they play. And you refrain from giving the role to the Fed being the one bank in the world, right? So when you have mentioned the C6, but do you not underestimate the role of the Fed, specifically when I think of the incident in 2013, or even now with the interest rate increase, right? How that would or was prepared, right? So that the world is prepared for that one bank to do that move. So with that, underestimating the role of the bank.
Should we take another one?
Are there any questions?
Yes, Professor, thanks for your talk. I have two questions for me. First, what is the role of capital control or capital management in your view of the international monetary system? For example, Helen Ray recently in 2013 had a paper that argued that capital control is required in the international or globalized financial system to gain monetary independence. And do you have the same sort of view? And then the second question is the impact of local currency settlement. For example, the rise of the RMB as the currency for trade settlement. Also, Malaysia had a recent agreement with Bank of Thailand to facilitate such settlements. Earlier you mentioned that it is still a dollar-based world out there. But if the world uses these regional currencies for their regional trade or investments, and if the infrastructure to facilitate such settlements continue to develop, what is your take on the impact to your model of international financial market? Thanks.
And with that, I have to just back on another question for myself.
That was 3 already.
It's related to the first and the question. With the rise of possible imminent rise of the RMB, how will it disrupt this international hierarchy of money?
That is the same question as the third one. Okay. All right. I'll just take them in order. Have I underestimated the role of the Fed? Perhaps verbally. Let me just restate what I do think of as the role of the Fed. In this hierarchical diagram here, notice that I put dollar on the top and then I put C6 swap line the second. So the C6 swap line is relation between 6 central banks, one of which is the Fed. The dollar that's at the top, I'm working this out, so I may change my mind next time. Is, I think, an international private dollar. Okay? That its liabilities of global banks, okay, are the world reserve currency. Not liabilities of the Fed, not liabilities of the central bank. It's liabilities of private banks, dollar liabilities of private banks. are the world reserve currency, and the central banks are being a backstop of that system. This is a theme probably throughout the talk that you've noticed that I keep emphasizing, that there's a kind of logic to private money markets that we need to be understanding, and not think that the central banks sort of are creating stuff, okay? That or that states are creating stuff. There's a kind of inherent logic to the private system. And then it's backstopped and it's surrounded by these central banks because they have the state on their side, which the private financial institutions don't or shouldn't anyway. They sometimes have a little bit too much control of the state. So where does that leave us in terms of the Fed? Well, certainly the Fed is the first among equals. Okay, I think that's true. That these swap lines are all with the Fed. They're really about dollars. That the Bank of England get dollars. It's true that they look symmetric in the sense that yes, if the Fed needed pounds, it could get pounds. Okay, but this is about dollars. Okay, and there have been started to be some other elements of the swap line. For example, the swap lines between the Bank of England and the Swiss National Bank, for example, or the ECB and the Bank of England. So this network is getting established. It's not all going through the Fed. Okay, it's going a little more around. It's filling in the nodes of the network. But it doesn't necessarily all have to go through the Fed. And I think that's very good for domestic politics in my country. Okay, that if you look at the Federal Reserve Act, it does not really give authority to the Fed to be the central bank of the world. And it is, when Janet Yellen says she's worried about the effect of the interest rate move on the rest of the world, this is new. Let me just tell you that the Central Bank of the United States has basically never been able to admit that. Paul Volcker saved the world reserve function of dollar in 1979, okay? And he was quite deliberately trying to do that, but he could not say it. He had to say, we're whipping inflation, we're adopting a monetarist target, all of this. This was not true, okay? This was not what he was really doing. He was saying, look, it's not good for the world what the U.S. is doing. The U.S. needs to get its act in gear, or the world is going to fall apart. And we need to do this for other people's sake as well as our own. So Janet Yellen hinted, that she didn't raise in September when she thought she was going to. Why? Not because of anything from the U.S., okay, because of the rest of it. And now, so we're starting to have language where the Fed can at least admit that it is looking at the rest of the world. Of course it's looking at the rest of the world, okay? It would be idiotic if it wasn't looking at the rest of the world. But it is domestic consumption that is a big problem, okay, in the U.S. So partly I want to say the reason I underemphasize the Fed is because I want to. I want to emphasize the private markets and the private dollar market. The other reason is because I think the Fed cannot really be what the Bank of England was. Okay, it's not going to be like that. That it's visibly the center of the world markets. I think not. So we have to find some other institutional structure that maybe. And that's a good thing about having an image of one big bank. It doesn't mean that it has to be one big central bank. It's the one big bank system, the private system. And that can operate without the Fed being at the top of it. But what about the periphery? That's basically what the second question is. The capital controls. Are capital controls okay to try to achieve monetary independence? I think monetary independence is largely an illusion. However, maybe when you speak of monetary independence, usually it's a way to put a positive spin on a mood of desperation. Okay? That the survival constraint is binding for you, and you're being forced to do things you don't want to do, and so you say, forget about the survival constraint. We're going to go it alone. And you try to be positive. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. If you cannot pay your bills, then you can't pay your bills, and you need to back off for a while and separate yourself from the system until you get your act together. That's, I think, inevitable. So I would not say that it should be forbidden to do. I mean, how can you possibly forbid people to do capital controls? If you can't pay your bills, you can't pay your bills. You know, that's it. You know, you can't force people to do things they're unable to do. Maybe you can force them to do things they're unwilling to do, but you know, mostly the cases that I've seen in the world are not of that kind. They're mostly being unable, actually unable. People like to be part of the world system, and it's painful not to be part of the world system. So it's better to think of ways to maintain that. Now, in terms of local currency settlement, I view this not at all as any threat to the dollar or anything like that. Okay, this is about economizing on world currencies, and it's the way all banking systems work. That you sort of clear at the lowest level possible, and you net everything out, and then the next level up you net out between that. Just as in the United States, it was always this regional clearing. You would clear within a region, and they became our individual feds. And then the feds would clear with each other in New York, and then there's clearing at the global level. So it's a hierarchical system in clearing where the settlement constraint binds. So to the extent that you do local currency settlement, that actually economizes on the flows of the world reserve currency, and so therefore actually relaxes the survival constraint of everyone involved in that. So that's a perfectly fine thing to do, I think, and a reasonable thing to do. I just want to be clear that it's not a threat to the dollar. Okay, it's actually a way of connecting up with the dollar system. That's what this is about. This is about figuring out where China is going to fit into this international monetary system. And at the moment, okay, it's not one of the C6. At the moment, it has now been added to the SDR. Okay? But that just means that other central banks have to accept RMBs. The real issue is going to be about the private marketplace, always. And the integration, and what does it mean? What does I mean by private marketplace? I mean, where do forward exchange rates come from? Okay, they come from the interaction of two private money markets, one in one currency and one in the other currency, and the term interest rates in each of those currencies. That's where forward rates come from. When we get integration of world money markets such that the RMB forward rate is connected, those two money markets are rubbing up against each other, then talk to me. Okay, but that's not happening right now. This is really just, maybe let me just nail that a little firmer, because I know this issue with the RMB is very important. When you think about an exchange rate, what is it? What is it? It's, one way to think about it is that it is the relative price of the liabilities of two central banks, two state banks. That's one way to think about it. That's sort of the way the newspapers think about it. And in fact, the language around the RMB going to the SDR is that sort of way. But it is also true that the exchange rate is the relative price of two private financial systems, okay, in different countries. Okay? That's what that means. Okay? That exchange rate, the relative price of private bank deposits in one country and private bank deposits in another country. That's what we're talking about in terms of really the one big bank idea. Right? The one big bank idea means that you can move back and forth between these private banking systems. And being able to just hold reserves at the central bank or something, this is not important compared to that depth in which I have in fact, my latest blog post was RMB and SDR now what? Okay. And basically that was the argument I made that to maybe return to Charlie Kitterberger, he used to say, governments propose, markets dispose. And the governments have now proposed that the RMB is the equivalent of the other members of the SDR. And I said, okay, fine, you propose that. Okay, we'll see what happens. That doesn't make anything happen, really. It makes some things happen, but it's just a proposal. It's a proposal. And now we'll see where the world goes with that. 50 years from now, maybe things will be different. But I do think the dollar has a long way to run. Maybe I'm biased, I live in Manhattan. But I don't think it's the Fed's dollar. That's what I'm saying. It's the private dollar. It's the private dollar. And that's why it has a long way to run. That's why it has a long way to run. Because that's the nature of it.
Right, we have 5 more minutes, so any more questions?
I answered your question.
Yes, yes. Yes, Nancy.
You showed the expansion of the balance sheet of the Fed and mentioned the same for the Bank of England, Swiss National Bank, etc. There's some talk, a lot of talk of whether and how the balance sheet is going to go back to normal, whatever. I mean, the normal is the essentially improved part. Is that important? Can we just, do they have to have a strategy for to get back to that? Or will it just happen if things don't crash again, and we'll go back to that system? You don't need to worry about it.
Well, you give me 2 choices, and I don't want to take either one. I do want to say, I think we're not going back to status quo ante. That's sort of first point. So the kind of discussion that you often hear in the press and in public statements of the Fed, where they're imagining or they're selling what they're doing as if we're on a road to get back to normal, okay, which is pre-2007. I don't think so. And that's part of, I think that's just a consequence of this framework that I've been laying out, that we're in a different sort of world. The Swiss National Bank, by the way, their balance sheet, okay, was very different from this in the first place. I mean, that really is an international bank, okay? They're much more than that, with all these currency exposures and everything like that. So the Fed doesn't really have those things because they wouldn't be allowed to. But so I think it's an open question what the equilibrium balance sheet of a central bank will look like once we get out of war finance and return to peace finance. I think that probably we will. We should get all of these mortgage-backed securities off the balance sheet of the Fed. There's no particular reason that we need to have that. The problem is QE. And that's true not just for the Fed, but that we've been using the central banks to push on the strength. To make asset prices higher than they would be. Not lending freely at a high rate against good security, okay? But lending freely at a low rate, okay? In order to stimulate the economy. That's monetary policy. That's not catching the falling knife. That's not catching the collapse of the money markets on the balance sheet. And most of this is about that. Right? If you look at that, just show again the students in the room, you know this, but that if you look at the initial wave of instruments, of facilities that the Fed created, they were mostly all created in this Bagehot way. They were outside spread. They were expensive credit, and so the people who received those had a big incentive to pay that back as soon as they could. Okay? And they did. They did. That's how the crisis worked. This big aqua marine, that's the $1 trillion worth of mortgage-backed securities. This is the Fed responding to the political exigencies of the time to say, we have all these households there that are underwater. Okay, we need to support housing prices. There's all these mortgages, okay, in European banks, which they're just going to sell for pennies unless we move them somewhere. Okay, so let's kill 2 birds with 1 stone. Let's move them onto the Fed's balance sheet. And as the crisis facilities shrink, we'll replace all of that with mortgage-backed securities. That's what the first QE was. Then there was, let's buy long-duration treasuries and all that. So you've filled your balance sheet with assets that you bought at not very good prices. And that makes it a lot harder to exit than if you had filled it by buying things at 50 cents on the dollar, putting the floor on prices. You don't have to get par, to get out. So mostly the Fed's balance sheet is contracting as people pay back their mortgages, as they move, and things like that. Those are the forces that are causing contraction, and that will eventually, shrink that balance sheet. But I don't really know what the future balance sheet will look like. I don't think it's going to look like 2007. I don't think it's going to look like 2010. I think there is going to be more connection between the central banks in the world, less purely national stuff. Mostly right now, that's off balance sheet. That's what these swap lines are. These are off balance sheet commitments to lend and borrow. They don't show up on the balance sheet, but they are credit lines. They are credit lines, and that's a newish sort of thing. So again, you point to the vital questions that are unanswered, and not by me, but by everyone else too. And so we should all think about them. This is what we need. This is exactly where we need this kind of question. What does peace look like?
I think with that note is a good point to end today's public lecture. As you can see, Professor Mehrling has only started, right? And we're definitely looking forward for many more years of your work.
Thank you.
Again, please join me to thank
ladies and gentlemen, this is the refreshment outside. Thank you. Also, please fill up the evaluation forms and pass me the